So recall here, as Lisle points out, that we're merely, though importantly, learning to spot invalid argumentation, like the examples we just saw, errors in the chain of reasoning within the progression from premises to conclusion. However, an argument can be perfectly valid, obey the rules we've just explored of formal logic, and yet still be false, or unsound as Lisle puts it. And that's because, as we've already learned in previous talks, it may be that while the arguments are valid, with valid premises or propositions and a valid conclusion based on those, either a modus ponens or modus tollens, as they're called here, that is to say, affirming the antecedent or denying the consequent, which are valid logical arguments, there are nevertheless presuppositions or assumptions in the worldview that went into those, the glasses the person is wearing, that form the albeit valid premise that is nevertheless unsound. Unsound as in inaccurate, because it doesn't start from biblical truth, which means it fails to pass the AIP test, arbitrariness, inconsistency, and the preconditions of intelligibility, which we looked at before. So because the basic presuppositions upon which the premises are based fail the AIP test, they're arbitrary and or inconsistent and or fail to provide the preconditions of intelligibility, what needs to be in place for knowledge, for science, in the first place. That argument, despite being valid formal logic, is defeated before it even begins. So we have to bear in mind that there is more than one test, one way to test an assertion. And there's more than one test an assertion must pass to be worthy of our belief. It must pass both the AIP test and the logical validity test, which we've just learned and which you see on this slide in this chart. So this chart is a very useful tool for you to test whether it's logically valid or not, whether the argument is accurately constructed. So if a person has an absurd premise, something that violates the AIP test, like evolution in millions of years, then even though the reasoning may be valid from there on out, it remains an unsound position because its premises were false to begin with. For example, we need an example of this, so Lisle provides an example of a perfectly valid modus tollens argument. So that's an argument that denies the consequent, which is valid. But because it has a premise that violates the AIP test beforehand, it's unsound and must be rejected despite being valid. So here it is, Lisle lays it out. It goes, if there was proof of God's existence, P, then there would not be any atheists, Q. So that's the first premise. Second premise, there are atheists, not Q, denying the consequent. Therefore, it is not the case that there is proof of God's existence, not P. So here's a valid syllogism or argument, this three-part premise, conclusion argument that we've been studying in formal logic. It's valid. It's a modus tollens. It denies the consequent. That's fine. So logically it's valid. You can see it in the third row of the chart there. And yet it remains false because it has an unsound premise, a false presupposition at the outset, which is that if there were proof of something, then everyone would accept it. But when you think about that, you realize, no, of course not. The existence of proof doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be accepted by everyone. So that's a false statement. There's abundant proof, abundant evidence for the creation. The entire universe is evidence, in fact, and yet few believe it. And more broadly, there are many things for which there's abundant proof, yet few believe in them. For example, in popular culture today, there's abundant proof that there are only two biological genders for Adam's race, male and female. Yet it seems few believe that to be true today. Or there's abundant proof that the so-called China virus vaccine is not a vaccine at all. Yet it seems few believe that. Or there's abundant proof that there's a globalist group of the rich and powerful systematically stripping away the authority and freedom of the citizenry of Western nations. Yet few believe in that either, evidently. And of course, I could go on. There are many examples of this type of valid argument logically that's nevertheless false, because they have false presuppositions at the outset, that if there's proof of something, that people will believe it. That's a false presupposition. That's not how people work, sadly, because of our sin nature. So, this is why we've already learned the AIP test to determine whether a person's worldview is sound, that is, based on the truth of Scripture, the biblical creator and his origins account in Genesis 1 to 11. Now, we've also learned how to determine if a person is reasoning validly upon So now we've learned this second thing that we're looking at today on this slide, this second tool, the ability to determine if a person is reasoning validly upon his or her worldview with valid argumentation. But you need to run both of those tests, both the AIP test and the logical validity test. So we've got these two tools for testing true logic now, which are very helpful for you in your spiritual warfare as a Christian. We need to test the truth claims of others and test beliefs that we may personally hold but shouldn't, that maybe we need to reassess now that we have these tools. So you're now equipped to assess what you read, hear, and see in the world and in conversation. And I strongly encourage you to hone these skills and techniques to defend your faith, to practice them, and to be ready at all times to give a reason, an apologetic, a defense for the hope that's in you, and to be engaged in your spiritual warfare to which you've been called as a Christian soldier, tearing down strongholds, like this example that we saw and so many others, and capture every thought that raises itself up against the knowledge of God. Without God and without His Word, we can't know anything. So we need to bring false thoughts, logical errors, into captivity to the obedience of Jesus Christ, obedience to His Word. And I encourage you to review these talks, the videos in this course, to hone these skills, and consider taking our Moodle course as well, which will help you to do that.